For centuries, humans have been growing alongside our botanical brethren. Our histories have mixed and mingled to bring us modern medical marvels, faded folklore, and everything in between. Of course, in order to understand the plant, we have to start with its roots. I'm M. Grubner Gaddis, and this is Rooted. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Rooted, where this week we're asking the hard-hitting question, do plants have feelings? Now, this is again a lightly rooted episode, so we won't be doing any kind of hardcore research. This is a bit of the show where you research along with me, but it's definitely something I've been curious about, something I've been hearing a lot about, so I figured we could dive right in. We'll be looking at this from a few different angles, everything from can plants feel pain, to just in general, do they have feelings, do they know when they're being touched, and can they help each other, do they have any kind of altruistic emotions? These are all questions I do not currently know the answer to, so I figured we could just dive right in. For starters, we'll be going to How Stuff Works, which is part of Science.com, and then this is just an article called Plants Feel Pain. Well, really, do plants feel pain? A primer on plant neurobiology. Okay, and they're starting this article by essentially asking you to picture the smell of fresh cut grass. It's a hot summer day, your neighbors are mowing, and the air is filled with just the slightly sweet kind of vegetal smell of freshly cut grass. And they're letting us know that the smell we associate with cut grass is actually kind of their equivalent of screaming in agony, because what they're doing is they're sending out a chemical distress signal to kind of let everyone know, hey, there's someone over here, they are munching on me. Typically, it would be insects or something that are doing the munching. So essentially, if you've got any chemicals in there meant to protect yourself from munching that could make you a little less tasty, now's the time to send those out. And the question there is so we know that they clearly know they're being nibbled on, but does it hurt? It's hurting them in the sense that it's not good for them, but do they feel pain? And then they're going on to explain how we feel pain, which of course is in our nervous system, which has specialized receptors, neurons, and different parts of our brains that essentially relay the information. So when something hurts, we feel it because there's different little bits of our bodies that are oh hey, let's alert the brain that that's happening and it's not great. But do plants have that? We know that plants use a bunch of different chemical and electrical signals to be able to sense how the light is moving, how gravity is impacting them, what the temperature outside might be, and if they're being touched. And they can also respond to stimuli like growing toward or away from things, or adjusting the way that they're growing and producing compounds against predators. So we know that they're aware of their surroundings in some ways, and we know that a lot of it has to do with the chemicals and things that they're sensing through their roots, through their leaves, etc. But is it just kind of hormones, or are there true sensations there? And now they're moving into the conversation around chemical defenses. And we've talked a lot about this on the show. Obviously, plants are doing a lot of defending themselves through releasing chemicals, and sometimes those chemicals are what makes them toxic to us. Occasionally, those chemicals are what make them helpful to us, like the fact that a lot of plants are anti-inflammatory because they're actually trying to heal their own tissue. But luckily for us, those properties also apply to our skin. So that's one of the reasons that we see plants having a lot of the same active uses, especially when they're in the same family, is because they're using these chemical defenses to try to protect and heal themselves. Okay, and now we're moving into the fact that there's a complex biological network, and essentially here we're just talking about the root system and mycorrhizal networks, and we talk a lot about this in the fungal variety pack episode we do with Friend Diagram, But essentially, the mycorrhizal network is a way that plants can send nutrients and resources to each other, as well as communicate about like what's going on outside. So a really great example of them using this to be able to kind of learn things about the environment is when they do what is called like mass fruiting. So like pecan trees, plums, a lot of trees do this, but essentially instead of just one tree randomly fruiting at random times, whether it's because it has more nutrients or it likes the sun it's in a little bit better, we don't see a lot of fruit trees fruiting at different times. And obviously from an evolutionary standpoint, this is likely because if everyone fruited at different times, it would be a lot easier for squirrels or anyone else who eats the fruit to eat all of it. And while certainly some plants have developed external fruit to be tastier, knowing that animals will eat them, there are plenty of things like nut trees where that's not necessarily the case. Like, they accept squirrels are going to eat them and it's fine. They're hoping squirrels forget about them, but it would ultimately be just fine for them if any of their seedlings survived without getting snacked on, squirrel involvement or not. So they choose to all fruit at once, with the idea being that squirrels couldn't possibly eat every single pecan in a grove if there's that many all at once, so they have a much better chance at having some of their seeds survive. And one way they communicate that information is through the mycorrhizal network, where they're able to say to some of the weaker trees, hey, you didn't get enough sugars to produce fruit, but we really want to produce all of our fruit at once all over the place, so none of us are getting targeted. So here, have some of my resources, so you can fruit with all of us. And that's how we know they're doing that. So that's an example of them at least being able to share resources and having some semblance of camaraderie. But this is where it gets interesting, and this is partially what piqued my interest in this topic. So I've been seeing all over, and I don't know if it's just that I've been on a weird research kick or what, but I've been seeing a lot of information on screaming cucumbers and just general queries of plants feeling pain or reacting to something that we as humans would consider painful. And they actually do a pretty good job of breaking this one down. It's a little freaky, but essentially, there are a group of researchers at the Institute for Applied Physics at the University of Bonn, which is in Germany, and they discovered that when you cut into certain kinds of tomato plants, they release gases that are essentially the human equivalent of screaming out in pain, and they did this by using a laser-powered microphone. And essentially they put it really close to the plant, and what they discovered is that if you slice into the plant while they're holding it, there is a very specific sound wave that is produced by the plants that as they release gas when they're cut or injured, that's not necessarily happening when we're just touching them, when we're not doing anything to them. It is specifically only if we cut into them. And obviously, we can't hear it, but we do know that they also scream when they're sick and when they get trampled on. So it's not just cucumbers. There's a bunch of different plants that do this, but cucumbers were just easy to study. Similarly, they did this experiment near tomatoes and tobacco plants that were dehydrated or just naturally damaged, and they were able to hear those same sounds from about 4 inches away. And so they would be detectable by certain organisms. It's just our ears as humans are not necessarily the best. But they are clearly communicating ow, that kind of hurts. And then this is another one that's interesting. I actually hadn't heard of this, but it turns out that chewing sounds can also freak plants out. Now I feel kind of bad for eating outside near the plants. I always thought it was just kind of nice to sniff the lavender and eat my dinner, but apparently I'm just really upsetting them potentially, because apparently plants can hear themselves being eaten. Researchers at the University of Missouri-Columbia found that plants understand and respond to chewing sounds made by caterpillars who are munching on them. So, if you're a tomato plant, you can hear the sound of your tomato plant friend getting munched on by hornworms, which is awful because even I hate that sound, and they're not even munching on me. So, for some of them, they found evidence of communication systems, whether they're emitting noises via gas like what we just talked about, or just kind of releasing those stress hormones, it sounds like. And so some people are saying, like, yes, if they're emitting gases, they're responding to an external stimuli that we can infer doesn't feel good. So therefore, like, they can feel pain because they are responding to a stimulus. And other people are saying, like, it can't be that it's pain because they don't have a brain or nervous system to register that feeling. But other scientists are saying, well, we can't really ignore. It's not just that. We've done studies on sensitive plants, and we know that they can store information because sensitive plants in this study, which we can look at it next, but essentially, the plants in this study, they did it on sensitive plants, those little guys that you run your finger down and they close up or don't close up. They did a study where essentially they isolated some and didn't touch them. They put some in medium traffic areas and some in super high traffic areas. And they essentially just recorded, like, how long does it take before plants in the really busy areas stop responding to specific stimulus because it takes more energy than what they determine it to be worth. So they were kind of wondering, like, do these plants store information? Because obviously, if a sensitive plant closes every time it's touched, then it's not getting less sensitive to stimuli. It closes the same every time. But in these plants, where they were isolated, they found that they do close less the more they're touched, which means they have to have some way of storing that information to know not to respond to that stimulus every time. And I need to do some more research about, like, how long that lasts for. But I was also talking to one of my friends who's a horticulturalist, and she was telling me something that is kind of similar but a little different. So essentially she works in a lab where they are regularly propagating plants, meaning they're taking cuttings and rooting them from that. And something that's really interesting about the plants, she's specifically working with cannabis plants right now. But something that was really interesting to me is she was saying that as she was cutting the plant, you would anticipate, just like anything else, most plants before they're cut grow in a kind of leggy, long growth pattern, but the more you cut them, the more they're encouraged to grow out instead of up. And something that she noticed was in the clones they were taking, they were still growing with the same growth pattern that a plant that's been cut 1,000 times would grow. So they weren't prioritizing that kind of taller growth. They really were still continuing to prioritize growing outward, even though this is new growth material. This isn't growth material that's been cut before. And it's now no longer even a part of that root system that has been cut 1,000 times. So clearly for plants, there is a way to store that information, but from what I've been finding in my research, we still don't have all the answers as to where they're storing it, because we know they don't have brains the way that we have brains. So that's something that's been pretty interesting too. Okay, let's look into, like, the article we just read is from science.com, but it's very much written more for, like, lay public. They're not putting a lot of information about the tests in. So let's go back to that sensitive plant. Interesting. Okay, so in this particular study that I was thinking about with the sensitive plant, which I'm sure we'll cover in an episode at some point, they were checking predator and anti-predator behavior. So for the sensitive plant, when they close, it's because they're worried something's going to eat them. They want to be less available. And what they found short term was that the more they were just kind of bumped and not attacked, the less likely they were to close. But the more they were attacked, the more they were likely to respond to even lighter stimuli. So just like the more you touch them in a not attacky way, the less they respond. They can essentially become anxious, where, like, even a small flick might cause them to close and stay closed for longer. And what they observed is this actually kind of depended on a plant-to-plant scale. So, like, one plant might decide that it needs to hide for much longer than other plants in the study, just because it was like, whoa, that was super freaky. I need some time. Okay? I need some time to decompress. And you know what? Go off, queen. But they also did this on a longer time scale. So they did a short time scale and found that there's a different variation time for each of these plants. It's very individualized, but they are responding more to the stimuli. And over a longer period of time, they noticed that eventually a lot of the plants returned more to baseline, the longer they went without predatory attacks, but it was still very individual on a plant-by-plant basis. So some of these plants were still taking a significantly longer time to stop the hiding behavior, which was closing their leaves, than other plants were. So that's pretty interesting, and it definitely kind of indicates not only that plants can have feelings, but that plants can have, like, different feelings plant per plant, the way that people kind of do. Which I kind of love thinking all of the plants in my garden are, like, very individualized, but still coming together to work together. I think that's really fun. They do point out in this abstract, and throughout the study, I'm not going to review the whole study right now, but it will be in the show notes. They do say that some of this could potentially be because of slight differences in care. Obviously, that can be a little bit hard to control for sometimes. And as far as I know, I don't know that this has been super repeated. This is like an ongoing study. It is basing itself off of research from what I can see as far back as 1969. Again, we've been wondering, do plants have feelings for like a long time? And this study specifically is this is from 2017. And like I said, it's basing itself off of research from 1969 on up. This has been an ongoing problem, and I don't know that we have an answer yet. It's definitely something we are continuing to be curious about. But moving along, okay, this article specifically is talking about kind of the same thing. We're on bbcearth.com reading Plants Have Feelings Too by Bethany Nichols. And Bethany here is talking a lot about how they can smell the chemical stimulants that are being sent out by other plants, but Bethany's also talking about stalkless plants and how they can be really sensitive, and even Venus flytraps and how we know they clearly respond to external stimuli by closing and having those modified leaves. So she's kind of just pushing back and continuing on with those thoughts from the first article. So we won't spend too much time here. Let's move in to Science Daily. Plants might be helping each other more than we thought. Okay, so scientists in this are specifically talking about trying to establish seedlings in a very challenging soil where there are mature plants around of the same species. And what they're finding is that often there will be a large and established plant, which they're referring to as a nurse here, that actually will try to shield seedlings from really harsh sun or anything by putting on like extra limbs over there, or maybe lowering a limb to let more light in. But also, through the mycorrhizal network, which we've been studying a lot more, we found that plants are also able to kind of push nutrients over through the mycorrhizal network, whether that be sending glucose so that the young seedlings have more energy, or just generally trying to make more room for them in the canopy, or sharing some water. And they also found clear evidence that these plants are actually more likely to thrive when they grow together because they're able to kind of share resources more so than other plants. So in adding seedlings, they would have kind of expected that the larger tree would have been more competitive, but instead what they find is that the older tree really wants to support the seedlings and help them to stay alive because then they're able to help each other. And the more nurse and seedling partnerships that there are, the more variety of plants come. So that also kind of helps to explain, like, if you just start gardening, obviously you might get more weeds, but you're also going to start seeing a lot wider variety of plants. And part of it is absolutely the care you're putting into it, but some of it is people are being like, ooh, the plant people are like, that seems like a good neighborhood. They all have good neighbors. So they want to move in, and then obviously where there's more plants, there's more pollinators. Where there's more pollinators, there's happier flowers, so there's more fruit, which means you're going to get more birds who are going to do what? They're going to plant more seeds. So it's interesting, but obviously it kind of proves plants like to live in community just like we do. And I think that's kind of nice. And again, they're invested in helping each other. Even if it's not the same species, they are still invested in saying, like, I'm being munched on over here, or like, does anyone have a cup of sugar I could borrow? They are working together, and we love to see it. And with that, I think we can kind of answer I think plants absolutely do have feelings. I don't know if it's like quite on the same exact level as how we feel, but clearly they're invested in each other's growth, so they care for each other. They let each other know when they're experiencing pain, and while we don't know if they feel pain in the same way we do, we know they're reacting to that stimuli, so clearly they're feeling something, and they have a way to store that information and share it with their friends. And I think that does technically answer the question. I feel comfortable saying that plants absolutely do have feelings. But what do you guys think? Definitely feel free to let us know in the comments. I will link all of the articles and some additional reading in the show notes, and I hope you're having a lovely day today. See you next time. Until next time, be kind to yourselves, be kind to the earth, and just like a plant, drink your water. If you liked the show, please subscribe and consider leaving us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you listen. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram at rooted.pod. We're finally updating regularly on YouTube at rooted.podcast, and you can check out our website, rootedpod.com, for transcripts, updates, merch, and so much more. The show is written, produced, and hosted by me. I'm Grebner Gaddis, edited by Kat Friend of Friend Diagram, and our theme music was written and produced by Eric Cluxon. Rooted is a Henbane Media LLC production.